Pilots can go for a very long time without having any emergencies, although many of us have had at least one close call. Can you prepare for all these instances? That and much more on today's episode of Aviation Intrigue.
This is aviation intrigue.
Go while you are out giving glider rides in the last weekend, you had something a little interesting happen. Tell us about that.
Indeed. I was giving glider rides this weekend to young kids who are learning to and experiencing the joy of aviation. And I had something we call as road break. Usually we practice, but this time it happened for real.
Wow, and you had some explanation of that on our second glider episode that we prepare and train, and we also make sure that the rope is okay before you go. And I assume you did all of those things and you were prepared in case it happened, and it actually happened. Tell us the story.
Yeah, you'd think that we are prepared, right? So, before we get there, what this is a glider, in most cases, is towed up using a nylon rope that's being pulled by a powered airplane. And we showcase this in our episode of The Day at the Glider Port. What happens is, at any given point, this rope can break. And that's exactly what happened. As we were towing up, it was me and a high school student in the front experiencing his first glider ride, and boom, suddenly the rope broke. And it took me a couple of seconds to even realize what had happened.
Yeah, that's called startle effect, and we'll talk about that in the next segment where it takes a couple seconds to figure out, wait a minute, something wrong just happened.
Yeah, you are in a glider or an airplane, you're expecting things to go normally, properly, right? So when something happens, it takes your brain a couple of seconds to catch up, and that's what happened. But I think we got lucky. We were never in any serious emergency, primarily because when this happened we were already 1,000 feet up in the air, so it gave us plenty of room to maneuver and come back and land.
That's great that you had some extra altitude. I know we practice these from as low as 200 feet, which is the lowest where you should consider turning around to land at the runway. But luckily, you were much higher. So even after a couple of seconds, you had plenty of time, and you probably weren't that far from the airport at that point.
Yeah, when we give glider lessons, we say if you're less than 200 feet above ground, your best option is to fly the glider straight ahead and not make big turns. However, if you're at least 200 feet up, it does give you the ability to potentially return back to the runway. In this case, because it was 1,000 feet, I had plenty of options. I was able to set up nicely. I did land in the same runway that we took off, so most people didn't even know anything had happened.
Wow, so you were actually at traffic pattern altitude, which 1,000 feet is when you would be normally coming in to do an approach. So you were actually able to fly the full pattern down the runway and back and land where you took off. Where if it was much lower altitude, 200 feet or above, where you can do that, you would have actually turned around and landed on the opposite side.
Exactly. But I think what complicated things a little bit is that we were doing two glider flights. So we were taking turns flying one glider, and when that glider was up in the air, the second glider will launch. So as I was taking off, the previous glider was landing. So I'm in my toe up, and the other glider was landing. So when this happened, I had to make sure that the previous glider had landed properly and cleared the runway before I land. So it took a little bit of maneuvering, but since I had the altitude, I was able to circle, wait for the other glider set up properly. It's all in the practice, Elaine. This is why we practice. And this falls squarely in the bucket of things that you can practice, and therefore you should practice because you never know when it's going to happen. And I think
And
we have used this phrase before, is that when bad things happen, when emergencies happen, people don't rise to the level of the occasion. People usually drop to the level of their training. That's why training is important.
we've talked a lot about the importance of training, especially for emergencies. Now, I'm curious about your passenger. Did your young student know what was going on? Were you talking the whole time just to make sure that everything was okay as you came in to land again?
Honestly, I don't think he even knew something was wrong. And then later I explained that the rope had broken before we got to the desired altitude. And he was a great sport. And after we came back, we repaired the rope. Actually, we changed the rope, put a new rope in, and I gave him another ride, and he was a happy camper. I think he's going to try to pursue an aviation career.
Well, that's awesome. So you might have just been wondering, hey, why is this glider ride so much shorter than the others? But then he realized what happened, and it's great that you got to take him up again and spark his interest in aviation. This is a great example of a possible potential emergency again, but not a huge emergency because you were able to handle it safely. But it sounds like that things like this, when they do happen, are always a little bit different from what you've actually trained for.
Yeah, every flight, every time you're in the air is slightly different. The conditions are different. You're different. The plane is different. Weather conditions are different. And you just have to know what to do. And then that's when your instincts kick in. That's why I say you drop to the level of your training. So you develop that instincts. And I followed the procedure and everything worked out very well.
That is great that your passenger really had no idea that you had kind of an incident, a little bit of an urgent situation going on. And with the other glider in the air, that worked out really well. Anything that you would have done differently? Any takeaways? Any time? Have you experienced this before?
I have not experienced an actual rope break before, at least not that I didn't simulate. So it was the first time. It was good to experience it. There was at least one procedural mistake I made, minor procedural mistake that I learned from that next time I won't do, which is uh, when the rope breaks, you have to remember that it's possible that the rope broke in the middle. Therefore, piece of the rope could still be attached to the glider. So we are taught to pull the release handle to release that. And I kind of forgot when this happened. Luckily, there was not a rope attached to me. It was just a ring. So everything worked out fine. But that's some learning for me.
Wow. Any idea why the rope broke in the first place if this was your actual first real deal?
Well, this is nylon rope and it over usage. Maybe it got a little fatigued. I'm not really sure. But what happened is that there was some lift forming. And when it happened, the tow plane climbed up and was while it was on a left-hand turn. So my guess is that it probably put an additional force and therefore broke the rope. That's a guess.
And I understand that even though we've seen a couple of these things in the few years I've been at the glider port, it's still a really rare incident.
It is. It is. We still practice for it because when it does happen, you want to be able to kick into your habit and do what you have to do to safely land. And like I said, nobody even knew anything was wrong, or a lot of people didn't know, which is exactly how you like to keep quote unquote emergencies.
That actually sounds a lot like an also very frequently practiced emergency procedure called a simulated engine failure that we usually practice over and over and over again. But the instances of that actually happen are extremely rare. It's just that when it does happen, the stakes are really high. So I'll tell you that story in the next segment.
Elaine, I have experienced partial power loss flying a powered airplane. I believe you have, and maybe even more than that.
So years ago, as a new flight instructor, I did have one partial power failure that was a lot like the lower altitude rope break you had, except that I had lost a lot of engine power, had a little bit left, just enough to make a 90-degree turn down to the runway and land. And that was probably, I'd say, my only close call in terms of an engine failure.
I had a partial failure that I think I mentioned in a previous episode. And there, the the controls and the airplane started buffeting, kind of shaking, giving me the sense that something wasn't right. Can only imagine that if that was a full power loss or a catastrophic failure of the engine, you would have something that absolutely gets your attention.
Yes, a loud noise, loud vibration, flashing light, any of those things were going to get your attention. In my near emergency, where I had a total power failure this summer, there were no lights, no warning. And even though that's always in the back of your head when you're flying around, I was actually not prepared for a no warning power failure.
That maybe you could argue that that's even worse because if there's a noise, it gets your attention. Then you're like, you may be panicked, but at least you know you have to do something. If something is happening, it is possible for you to not even know. something is wrong until maybe it's too late.
Yes, and I can tell you how this happened because I was flying a basic airplane doing some test maneuvers. And so this airplane does not have a lot of warning lights. It has basic instrumentation, but they aren't lit up very well. And I was in bright daylight, focusing very much on some test flying maneuvers for a newer airplane that had to be flown, and certain maneuvers had to be done to make sure everything was working okay. So right in the middle of something, I see that the propeller stops. So I had no warning whatsoever. And we can talk about that 2 seconds of just kind of freezing when something startling happens, because that happens to everybody, no matter how well trained you are.
Yeah, I can imagine that if you're driving a car and you start to slip and slide in ice, it's going to take a few seconds for your brain to realize that's what is happening. And sometimes that is the difference between correcting versus getting in even worse trouble.
Yeah, it's amazing when things like this actually happen. Thankfully, very rarely. You talked about your rope break taking just that couple of seconds to realize something had just happened and then recognizing it, even though you're extremely well trained in rope breaks. And we practice in powered airplanes, engine failures all the time. That's probably the most commonly practiced emergency maneuver, even though that's among the rarest. But when you do need that training, wow, does it come in handy? Because at 2 seconds of freezing, realizing that my propeller stopped spinning, I'm 4,000 feet in the air, that's when the training kicked in, because I didn't even have to think about what to do at that point. I just started acting.
So that sounds pretty dramatic. Your propeller stops spinning in a powered airplane. So what did you do?
So this is common to what most pilots learn if they have a sudden engine failure. And without warning, it is pretty startling because there were no lights, no big bang or anything, just a stopped propeller. And at that point, it was already too late. It had stopped. First, you turn towards the best landing site. I had an airport a few miles ahead of me, pointed the nose right to it. And while I was doing that, I pitched the airplane's airspeed to what's known as best glide. What's going to keep me in the air the longest? We're not going to be pointing it down to the ground because that gets you there faster. We're going to be pointing it up ever so slightly just to keep as much lift on the wings as possible. So I did those two things within about 3 seconds.
So did you have to land in a field?
No, I was a few thousand feet in the air, but I did have doubts about making that airport. But since there were open fields all along the way, I decided I would head towards the airport, keep those fields under my wing, and if I really had doubts, I could make an emergency landing on a nice long farm field. But at that point, the third step of a engine failure emergency training kicked in, and that is, if you have time, and I had 4,000 feet to do this, see if you could start the engine. Maybe you accidentally flipped a switch. Maybe something else got kicked off in terms of the fuel. Maybe something else was going on. The engine had definitely stopped due to the propeller. And so I made sure the fuel was still on. Okay, I didn't kick it off. I made sure that the magnetos that start to spark the engine were still on. Okay, I didn't accidentally flip those off. I hit the starter button, and thankfully it fired right up. So then I was good to go. But I did climb quite a ways up over the airport just to make sure it didn't happen again.
So what gave you the confidence that whatever happened is not going to happen again?
Well, I wasn't 100% comfortable with the engine, so I kept climbing over this emergency airport just in case there was a problem. But that gave me a lot of time to look around. Okay, I'm flying. I'm over the airport in case it happened again. I was feeling much better at that point. I double checked the fuel gauges, the fuel valve, the fuel feeding to the engines. I had fuel in both tanks, and I did know this at the time, but it turned out that there was a fuel venting problem in one of the tanks. This airplane has a wing tank in the left and right wings. And while I was doing these maneuvers, apparently the venting had caused either an air bubble or a stoppage in fuel pressure that didn't allow that wing tank to feed into the engine. And that temporarily stopped the engine just enough to make that prop stop, which was pretty startling.
So that's in effect a momentary fuel starvation.
Yes, with no other malfunctions. So as soon as I felt comfortable enough. Of course, I climbed really, really high, and there were two airports on the way back to the place where I had launched test flying. I was actually keeping those airports within reach just in case, but at that point, I was fairly comfortable that there was just something in the fuel system that was temporary, because all the gauges were great. I had oil pressure, everything worked fine, but it was still in the back of my head, of course. And it turned out after I landed that they figured out what the problem was.
Well, I'm glad they figured it out. I'm glad everything worked out well. Unfortunately, for a lot of pilots, it doesn't work out well. Fuel starvation is a big problem. Engine partial power loss or full power loss. And especially if you're in the clouds, if you're in the night, if you don't have good landing spots, it just takes away a lot of options.
Yes, the engine failure in an airplane really, really is rare. It's just that when we see a lot of accident reports where the engine stopped, and then there's all different kinds of causes, like you mentioned, then it kind of gets into people's minds. Well, oh, that's maybe a little bit more common, but it's only because you're reading about the things that did happen. This is actually still a very, very rare occurrence, and like I described, pilots are trained to deal with it.
Yeah, I think in our aviation emergency episode, we talked about the statistics and how the statistics are actually much better than the perception of issues happening. So in this case, your training on how to deal with a partial or full engine power loss literally gave you the tools to safely create that safety. Thankfully, the engine was able to restart in your case, but otherwise, you probably would have landed safely somewhere.
Yes, that's where the training would have kicked in. If that engine, for whatever reason, did not restart, I would have either had to land in a field, the best one I could find, and with the weather being good, fields all over the place where I fly, that would have been great. And I possibly could have made a runway, which is the most ideal situation because it's the safest place to land on and there's help available. The one takeaway I would say, lesson learned, is that I did not get on the radio, but because the engine had started up so quickly, it's probably something I would have used as a resource if I could not get that engine started. And that would be the only thing that I might have missed.
Of course, and we are trained as pilots to always aviate, navigate, and then communicate. So communication, as important as it is, it's usually the third in our priority list.
Sure, if that emergency had actually developed into something real, I hope that I would have remembered to have gotten on the radio and say, hey, I'm headed here. Everybody get out of the way. Aircraft in distress and all those things that we are trained to do. But I didn't have a checklist, and that I think that's why sometimes in a real emergency we can forget a couple of steps. So it's great to have things memorized for those first three steps, which we always want pilots to do.
So the benign close calls, we talked about the startle effects, and then in the next segment, I think we should be talking about things that happen that it's kind of hard to practice, kind of hard to expect.
There are those things, and we'll talk about that next.
So, Elaine, there's clearly stuff that we practice for routinely, and if it happens, we handle it. And things that startle, and as soon as we get over the startle effect, we can again go back to our training and handle it. What about the categories of instances that where it's kind of hard to practice, very rare? How how have you experienced any of them, and how do you prepare for those?
A couple of, thankfully, very, very harmless things happen on the ground, but that I would not have wanted to experience with either a fast moving airplane on landing or in flight. I also, by coincidence, happen to have an emergency locator transmitter, which is located in every aircraft, um, go off by itself while I was taxiing out to go fly after it had been maintained. And that's not something that would ever have crossed my mind as something that would happen and turn into a pretty bad incident.
Yeah, so if people are not aware, a ELT, an emergency locator transmitter, is a device that's in most airplanes, and they are meant to trigger if you had a very hard landing or a crash, or you could manually activate it. It's very similar to personal locator beacons that hunters and trekkers would carry when they are up in the in the middle of nowhere, uh, and they're meant to locate your airplane if you were to be if something were to happen that it's kind of nobody knows where you are. They need to find it. So there are devices that can home in on these signals. And if it goes off on the ground, that's not very good.
No, and it's very common to have false alarms. There's the old style ELT. It's about the size of it's a small loaf of bread, and all aircraft are required to have at least have that. And there's a new kind that's satellite based that will also go off, but they're supposed to go off when there's an impact. They're designed to sense that and then send out the loudest alarm you have ever heard, louder than any alarm clock, but at about the same kind of tone. And the old ones were also meant to broadcast on a radio emergency frequency so that anybody in the area could hear it and say, hey, let's hone in on this ELT. But for them to go off on their own, it actually happens quite commonly.
Yeah, I mean, people who are familiar with the newest generation of iPhones, they know that there is a so-called crash detection built into iPhones that if you were in a car and crash, it's supposed to set off that same signal. So it's the same technology. I did pick up once a emergency located transmitter signal. We were flying with a client all the way from California to Wisconsin, and somewhere near Southern California, Northern Arizona, we picked up this signal. It sounds like an alarm. And we immediately communicated to the air traffic controller that we are talking to. And then other airplanes were starting to say, hey, it's louder here or it's fainter here. And we triangulated. And I assume that they were able to find whatever happened to that poor aircraft. But of course, we flew out of that space. So eventually it faded away.
Had a similar experience because pilots are trained on the emergency frequency all over the country, 121.5, to monitor that, especially if they're asked to. And the ELTs that are new now are satellite based, so they're much easier to pinpoint. If they go off in an actual crash, you can find them with a much more accurate GPS coordinate versus this old style on the radio where they have to hone in on the signal, taking it longer to find. So the new ones are actually quite a bit better in terms of the technology.
Yeah, thank goodness for that. Now, beyond that, there are other things that can happen. I assume that airplanes catching on fire or things like that, it's kind of hard to practice.
Yeah, speaking of fire, this was something that I never would have thought that an ELT, which, as we talked about, is meant to help people in an emergency. And occasionally there are false alarms, but we are all trained to treat every beacon, every ELT we hear as a real emergency, just in case, even though statistically most of them turn out to be false alarms. But the fact that an ELT could cause the emergency never even occurred to me that could happen. And I talked to a lot of people about this one. Nobody's even thought of an ELT potentially causing a fire.
How did that happen? It's an electrical fire, I assume?
Definitely electrical fire. So I am taxiing out, and this ELT had been serviced and maintained yearly, just like usual, routine. It comes with its own battery. Obviously, so it's self-powered, and there's a little switch on top to test it, and you're supposed to test it at the top of the hour so you're not triggering a real emergency. And I was taxiing out, and I hear that alarm, that very loud beacon. It was over the radio. It was in the back of the airplane. I thought, the ELT in the back is going off, and I'm just taxiing. I haven't even gone more than a few yards. So I stop. I tuned in 121.5. Oh, it just blew my ears off because it was right there behind me. I thought, I don't know why I had to do that, but I was just, wondering, is this me? And I could hear something in the back as well. And I thought maybe the switch triggered while I was taxiing. So I shut down. Of course, everybody runs out like, oh, Elaine, what's wrong? I go to the back. The switch is off. I thought, why is this going off? So somebody reached in, said, well, we'll get it turned off. Reached in, unclipped it because it's very securely mounted to the floor of this aircraft, pulled it out really fast and said, this thing is hot. So we're all backing away from this ELT that was smoking and dripping.
Yikes.
And so we're running away, and I tell the guy, okay, you'd better drop this thing in the parking lot. We're all just going to back out here.
So that must have been a short circuit or something.
It turned out to be a short circuit in a new battery, where the ELT was just fried because there was the connections were black. And by the way, we found out we didn't know that, but they're kind of like almost a 9-volt connector, a little positive, negative connector, and the mechanic was so curious. He went and got safety glasses and safety gloves, put it out in the middle of the gravel lot just because we were really afraid of this thing catching on fire. And it had overheated because of some kind of short circuit in the ELT itself. And the first thing I thought of was, guess what? What's the worst that could have happened?
Well, the whole plane can catch fire, right?
What if I was in the air? If this thing caught on fire, what would I have done?
Oh my goodness, yeah. In the back of the airplane, that's not good. I'm
Not
glad
good.
everything worked out okay.
Yeah.
It's ironic, like you said. It's like a smoke detector catching fire and putting the house
It
down.
kind of is. Now, in a general sense, airplane pilots are trained to deal with in-flight fires, but there's only so much you can do.
We do carry a fire extinguisher that works on certain kind of fire, but not on others. And this is also why in our training, we try to differentiate between electrical fires and engine fires, fires that is coming from outside. We have to treat them slightly differently, and that's why it complicates things.
Yes, we're taught that if there's a fire and you have an extinguisher, you're going to try that. But here you are in the air dealing with a fire extinguisher. The main thing we are taught to do is to make a high-speed descent, especially if your engine is on fire, maybe to get it out. Open the windows if you have smoke. Try to put out the fire. But the main thing is just to get down at a high speed as fast as you can. I mean, this is absolutely an emergency.
Yeah, and then you have to close the vent so you're not breathing in the fumes, etc. Elaine, this would be a good time to remind people that as experienced pilots and instructors as we are, this is not meant to be a flight instruction. So anybody who's listening should go take proper lessons and proper training for their particular conditions.
Yes, and we'll also emphasize that I will call this a close call, and I learned that even ELTs can potentially catch on fire, and you learn from these things. I was very lucky I was not in the air. I think about all the things I could have done, and there would not have been much with that being in the back of the airplane.
I'm a paranoid pilot. I just assume that things are going to go wrong, and that triggers my spidey sense, right? I mean, I'm always alert to what's going to go wrong. So even though you haven't dealt with or cannot anticipate a particular situation, you're in general expecting things to go wrong and are prepared to deal with it.
Yes, there are many moving parts in all aircraft, and the fact that you know that every moving part you are moving could possibly have a malfunction is a good thing to keep in the back of your mind. And even though it's extremely rare, you learn from every single one. So I would say a couple of close calls I had this year, I learned a lot.
You can practice some of this in a simulator. You can create these scenarios and practice and see how you respond, because most of the time it's just remembering what to do. Elaine, we also have certain checklists that we are supposed to memorize. And that way, when things happen, you're not looking for the checklist, you're not panicking. You try to do the procedure as the manual tells you.
Sure, just like the engine failure, if you can just remember the first 3 things to do after your startle effect goes away after a couple seconds, that goes a long way into increasing your odds of getting back safely.
Yeah, and the flight simulators are really, really good training tool to put yourself into situations that you would not normally do in a real life.
Oh, did I mention I also had a brake failure this summer? That's also not something you can train for safely in an airplane, but we can in a simulator, which I actually got to do recently. But all that was good. Couple of close calls this summer that I hope I don't ever have to go back to.
If you have personally experienced or witnessed any kind of airplane emergencies, we'd love to hear from you. Please share your stories in the comments.
This is Aviation.